Sometimes I encourage people to go through their contract and cross out the words that are extraneous.
Hello, welcome back to this edition of MyProfessionalNet Expert Highlights. I am Emma Riggi, the director of MyProfessionalNet, here with Marie Bernier, who is our program manager for architects and engineers at Professionals Best, but also on the risk management side provides contract review services. Marie, thank you for joining me.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Do you want to start off by introducing yourself, telling us a little bit about you?
Sure. Most of my career was spent in the underwriting area of the insurance business with both architects and engineers, but also other professionals such as real estate, miscellaneous professionals, and did a little bit of like construction management, things like that, as well as on the risk management side and integrating those together with looking at solutions for architects and engineers, not just contract review, but other types of solutions because they're very intertwined. So I've been doing it for over 25 years and it's been a lot of fun. It's been great to be at Professionals Best and work with this group on the MyProfessionalNet. So thank you for inviting me today.
Of course, I'm excited to chat. So let's start right off. Something that I always like to ask guests on this little show is COVID. I was just wondering what are the major impacts you've seen in both, the underwriting side and maybe for the risk management side, just in the general work environment or interacting with clients.
Sure, sure. I'll start with kind of the work environment and the general business environment because it does apply across the board to even small architects and engineers, as well as the larger ones. One of the biggest impacts was that a lot of companies went to remote working, almost 100%.
Right.
Even small offices did. And in some cases, it worked out great because they were set up very well to do that. In other cases, it created a lot of unknowns as to how to know what timelines and deadlines and things like that were happening. And so I think the aftermath of that has been some companies recognizing that they didn't put appropriate teleworking procedures in place, for instance. And then there were some inconsistencies, and that's where you get into employees being frustrated or feeling like they're being treated differently because
Right.
they don't have a one-on-one interaction. The other thing that also happened though, too, with the teleworking especially, is that companies uh, found that a lot of managers didn't know how to handle it because they may have been
Right.
micromanaged or things like that. So they weren't maybe coached appropriately. And I think that it could be a small firm or a large firm. Some people say with smaller firms, they're a little bit tighter knit, they're a little bit closer, but at the same time, you're still not dealing with in-person, one-on-one interaction. And I do think that
Right.
that's something that impacted offices. Now offices are trying
Yeah.
to go back, right, to
Right.
some kind of
Right.
integrated environment, and employees don't want to. So they're calling it
Yeah.
the resignation, where if people don't get the work environment that they want, they, are frustrated and they might move on. And that could impact architects and engineers specifically because that's a very specialized expertise. And it's hard enough to get good talent, today to have it moving around lots
Right.
of competitors. Yeah. So that was one thing that I would say on the risk management side was something that every company had to deal with during the pandemic, and the aftermath has almost been worse because trying to reintegrate
Right.
back to normal schedule. On one of the sort of, I'll call it like the psychological, emotional things that happened that I had done a few, sometimes I do a little bit of coaching, and I had done a few webinars on this relating to understanding when it was in the height of the pandemic. Now we're dealing
Yeah.
with a whole different landscape. But let's talk
Right.
about last spring of 2020. Let's talk about
Mm.
the summer as things were ramping up, and especially in the summer when people tried to open up. What I had to encourage managers to
Right.
understand is that sometimes you're dealing with an individual that has someone in their home that has COVID or is in the hospital
Right.
with COVID, or your kid, just your kids being exposed, and that takes a toll on you a little bit mentally, that
Right.
sometimes you get distracted. And
Definitely.
yeah, so there has to be an understanding of working with individuals that way. On the underwriting side, what
Yeah.
we've seen, yeah, so just to transition to the underwriting side, one of the
Yeah.
things we've seen is not knowing what was going to happen in 2020.
Mm.
Were people going to lose
Yeah.
contracts? Were
Right.
things going to get put on hold, et cetera?
Yeah.
And many underwriters, including Professionals Best, took an approach of carefully looking at what was reported for 2020 and making sure that we weren't looking at something a larger number than was expected prior to the pandemic.
Right.
Aftermath of that is that this year we're looking back at 2020, and some firms actually went above what they ever had thought they were going to do for
Mm.
two reasons. One is there are some projects that we're still working. Think about contractors. Contractors were essential employees. So
Right.
therefore, building continued, roads continued, things where you have civil engineers, they're still out there on their
Right.
projects. Houses are being built. Lots of houses were being built last year.
Yeah.
So that was very positive for some firms. That was one aspect. The second aspect that was really interesting was that some firms were advised, we don't know what's going to happen in 2021. So why don't you bill as much as you can and push your projects through this year, because 2021 is unknown. And that also then inflated the 2020 billings for people, where we thought they would be losing money, but the reality is
Right.
their fees are up, and their fees are up even in 2021. That does impact pricing. But the areas that are suffering are your big cities. Like if you look at San Francisco, for instance, if you are
Mm.
primarily doing office and commercial space, billings, could have gone
Right.
down half this year because no one's going back to work,
Ah.
or they're
Right.
or not leasing their space again. So they are struggling with new buildings and renovation of buildings. The one area that's
Yeah.
not struggling is the interior retrofit of a building. Now have to have offices and closed spaces
Of
versus.
course.
So that's kind of a long answer to the
Interesting.
COVID thing, but that's what we've been seeing.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me because I've heard, things haven't changed that much for where I work, or things have changed entirely. So it's just so different across the board. Moving on a little bit more to, the contract review services, the risk management side. I was just wondering if you could provide our subscribers with maybe some frequently asked questions that you get, or just some general tips you would give regarding contract reviews.
Sure. Two of the things that I think become the primary thing that people are asking, whether it's coming from the broker or the insured direct or the insured through the broker, is are my insurance requirements? Look at my insurance requirements. Am I meeting the requirements? And the second thing, and that it can be straightforward, not for an insured who, insurance is not an architect's and engineers, primary area of expertise.
All right.
Usually it's the broker and the underwriter. The second thing is, I'm being asked to sign this indemnification, and is it insurable, or are there any issues with it? Which becomes kind of a loaded question because indemnifications are all over the board. With regard to insurance requirements, part of the contract review services is to look at not only just the limits and deductibles and maybe special coverages that are required, but also to look at what the owner is asking as far as additional insured. They may be asking a common question owners ask for is, you will notify us if you have any claims that erode the limits, those types of things. So we look at all the clauses that go along with just the limit and deductible options. The limit and deductible options are important because both the broker and the underwriter then need to say, oh, well, they're asking for more, so we need to quote something higher. As far as requiring an insured to disclose if they've had a claim that will impact their limits, that's proprietary information. As an underwriting manager, we would never give that to a third party unless it was authorized. So that's kind of an interesting request on the coverage part of it. And some of the other ones that come across are being added as an additional insured, which is a very misunderstood concept in the professional liability world because it's not available in the professional liability world. There's sometimes some carve outs you can do on a very large contract, for instance, or something where it's an additional premium. But in general, you don't want to name additional insureds on your professional liability policy because that impacts your premium and the owner's not providing professional services. That's a simple answer. The reason it's asked for is that on commercial policies, it's very common because an owner can get named, let's say, in a trip and fall lawsuit where the architect or engineer was on site and something happened, and so they have to be able to, engage in the insurance. The owner does because that's more of a bodily injury, property damage type coverage, not really a negligence in the performance of professional services. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And kind of along those same lines, not necessarily just contract review, just general risk management. I think it's helpful to kind of, maybe some things you didn't know. I think providing those sort of little things could be super helpful to anyone watching or listening. So do you have any off the top of your mind, just, things you might not know that maybe you should?
Well, when we talk about indemnification, that's where we get really tricky because, some of them go on for 2 pages and you're thinking, how could you use so many words? But indemnification, this is something that I think a lot of professionals don't really know. But if you look at standard industry contracts, the basic ones don't have indemnification provisions because the standard of care for a design professional is to perform their services with the skill and diligence of a reasonable professional providing the same services in a similar locale. And if that standard isn't met, it means you're negligent. So then you have a negligent act, error, or omission, which is your responsibility or your liability. So indemnity is built into what is required of a licensed professional, but people want to see the words, so then they start adding all the words to it. And one of the tips is look at any of the kind of that just standard. What is my exposure as a professional? What am I required to indemnify for? And then you test your indemnification against that. So when words start to creep in, like indemnifying or hold harmless is used standard for breach of contract, for instance, if you're not negligent in your performance of professional services, and you're accused of breach of contract, that's actually a contractual obligation that's not covered by professional liability. The two other things that have crept in that I think insurers should be really aware of when they see it, one of them is paying prevailing party fees or the attorney expenses, costs, whatever related to that the owner has. That's actually not insurable. That's a contractual obligation to pay for the attorney's fees of someone other than the named insured. In some cases, you can buy and carve out coverage to cover attorney's fees for the owner of the project to the extent you're negligent. So the difference with that is a prevailing party provision says, if I prevail, you pay all my fees. I haven't seen an insurance policy that will do that. The second one is defend, which I've seen creep in just over the last 5 years that I've looked at contract reviews. It starts out with defend, indemnify, and hold harmless. We do not, when I say we, professional liability does not provide a defense to an insured's client, and it's not intended to. And so just by agreeing